So let's start diving into the subfields of anthropology. I already mentioned that biological anthropology is also called physical anthropology. Sometimes what it's called just depends on what state you're studying in. In Missouri, they call it biological. There are a couple of different schools in Nevada that call it either. Some call it biological, some call it physical. If you're in Texas, they call it physical anthropology. So it's just kind of biological is the more modern term. Physical is getting phased out. But anyway, biological anthropology studies humans as biological organisms that have evolved. So we spend a lot of time learning about evolution, adaptations, natural selection, and then looking at ancient hominins and how the hominins evolved over time and to result in who we are now, Homo sapiens sapiens. So ancient hominins are human ancestors. We even study primates, our living ancestors, to learn more about the human species. So there are subfields within biological anthropology, including paleoanthropology, primatology, forensic anthropology, and molecular and genetic anthropology. So again, biological anthropology is the study of humans from a biological perspective. There's a particular emphasis on their evolution and adaptation to environments. The origins of physical anthropology have to do with studying modern human variability. In the past, people used this badly and used arguments that were baseless about the shapes of people's heads and things like that, the color of their skin, to argue that they were inferior. As it states here in this slide, physical anthropology originated as an effort to chart and explain differences across human populations, but the field was also used badly as well. I think that's one reason why we're phasing out the term physical anthropology and moving on to biological anthropology. So, biological anthropologists are very interested in how different human populations across the globe have adapted differently to their environments. And there are many physical and biological, physiological adaptations that we can study that are very interesting. And that's kind of how we talk about humans, how we're different from a biological perspective, but biological anthropology looks at the ways humans are the same as well, and looking at our ancestral roots as primates and some features of other hominins help us do that as well. So I mentioned studying ancient hominins. This evolutionary tree is an example, and these are all hypothetical relationships amongst these fossil species. But paleoanthropology focuses on biological changes through time in order to understand how the human species evolved. It studies the evolution of anatomically modern humans, which is us, from an ape-like ancestor. It takes a biological approach, focusing on the interaction between biology and culture. For example, when hominins learned how to make and use stone tools, this changed not just our material culture, but our biological evolution as well. Primatology is the study of living and fossil primates. Studying the anatomy and behavior of our closest living relatives helps us understand what makes humans unique. Forensic anthropology is the identification of human skeletal remains for legal purposes, establishing age, sex, birth, population, stature, trauma, and disease. For example, if an individual is found, helping to identify them, or if there is a crime, helping to collect evidence or provide an analysis. So it's not just the study of bones for bones' sake, it's for legal purposes. Genetic anthropology, sometimes called molecular anthropology, uses genetic and biochemical techniques to answer questions about early human migration, human ancestry, how anatomically modern humans evolved in Africa and then emerged from Africa to colonize most continents across the globe. Moving on, so we talked about biological anthropology. Another field of anthropology is linguistic anthropology. It looks at the structure and history of language as well as its relation to social and cultural contexts. Of course, language is one of the most unique aspects of being human. Anthropologists in linguistic anthropology may work on preserving languages, determining language origins, and many other projects which examine language and social life. Moving on, another field is archaeology. Many of us are familiar with the name of this field or the idea of it from pop culture and movies. The study of human cultures through the recovery and analysis of material remains and environmental data. That is not a very flashy definition, but that's what archaeology is. It's a study of humans through what they leave behind, like cultural remains or material remains, not their biological remains like their bodies, but the stuff that they make and use and alter. Archaeologists can study past societies as well as current societies. You can see this man standing on a pile of garbage here. He's an archaeologist conducting a study at a dump. Most archaeologists study the distant past, studying cultures either without writing or with limited historic records. In order to do this, archaeologists must learn to read the material record. This is composed of all physical objects left behind by people. These objects include their tools, their homes, and even more ephemeral traces such as campfires and food remains. Using these traces, archaeologists attempt to reconstruct the culture of the people that left them. Archaeology does not focus exclusively on the distant past, though. The most famous example of a contemporary archaeology is the Garbage Project, directed by William Rathje in Tucson, Arizona. The study was about drinking, and as it turns out, people drank more beer, as seen by evidence of cans in their garbage, than they claimed to drink in surveys, or turns out they drank more than they admitted to, and we could only find this out by looking at the actual material remains. So there you have it, learning about people and their behavior by examining their material culture, or the things they leave behind. So, a few notes about archaeology. Archaeology has a unique perspective on what people do. And while we talk about archaeology, we might mention the terms such as prehistoric or historic. It's important to remember that history is a study of written records. Technically, prehistory is the time before written language was used in any given place. Archaeologists can study much further back in time than historians who are limited to written records. Archaeologists can also study within the ages of written records, so using archaeology to supplement what we know from history, or using historical records to determine research questions, and so on and so forth. This is called historical archaeology. Another great thing about archaeology is that it can capture information about people in a society. Let's say that there were historical records, there was writing, some people were literate, but many times in a society, especially in the past before education was more universal, there'd be plenty of people in a society, women, children, people of lower economic background that couldn't read or write. Archaeology can study those people as well. The historic record might have missed out on recording them for many different reasons, marginalized groups as well. So archaeology can step in and fill some of the gaps for the people who had been previously, unheard or unrecorded. So this concludes this part of the lesson. A final part of this introduction to anthropology lesson will discuss cultural anthropology and culture.